Hi, and welcome to another one of my lectures with PowerPoint slides. This is entitled Ethics, You, and Higher Education Leadership, and it is tied to your learning project number 5B in the workbook. So I'm going to do some screen sharing right now and bring up the PowerPoint presentation and start the screen share. And you should have this in front of you. I'm going to go to the larger view again and start. So this PowerPoint presentation is also on Blackboard, so you can look at it in your own leisure if you so desire. And then some of the links that are shown later on in the slide show will also be active for you. If you have never completed a statement of ethics in a class with me before, or perhaps some other class, I very much recommend that you choose learning project number 5B. If you are still interested in learning project number 5A, then consider utilizing that particular activity as part of your final project. In this, relating to this, I'm going to be utilizing or referring to a book that was edited by my colleague Ralph Brockett and I, entitled Toward Ethical Practice. And 3 of the chapters in that book, chapters 1, 2, and 6, are also on Blackboard to provide you some background reading as you go through, and I'll make reference to that again. So in terms of notions of definitions, normative assumptions are utilized here, and as you know from perhaps prior courses with me or others relating to ethics, or thinking or talking about ethics yourself, it involves such things as morality and moral behavior and values and spiritual belief. Even religion can be associated with ethics. As I'm sure that you know, though, it's not really what is just right and wrong. That often is in the eye of the beholder. So that's why normative assumptions and ethics makes the most sense in terms of the way I look at it, because this then involves you determining what is right or just in relationship to others, to people. And here is where some judgments about values and how they actually impinge on a variety of moral issues becomes very important. Another way of looking at ethics is to think about these normative assumptions and what they really mean in terms of right versus wrong and right versus right. And what do I mean by that? In essence, I suggest that not only is there right versus wrong, but there are often times when this needs to be shaded or qualified as right versus right. In essence, there often can be many different ways that ethical decisions can be right, and what is right for one person may not necessarily be right for another person, or what's right in one situation may not be right in another situation. So the whole notion of what is right has value that needs to be considered. So one of the things that will help, I think, in this is the notion of a model. This is right as noted there in the bottom of the slide from the Brockett and Hiemstra book, and it is the idea that there is a model that can be utilized to visualize the whole notion of ethical decision making. So when Ralph and I were thinking about this book about a decade ago, we wanted to look at ethical decision making from a process viewpoint. In essence, because Ralph and I, believe there are no clear-cut actions or steps that exist in making ethical decisions, and that the process itself is very complex. we decided to conceptualize this process with this particular visual model. It includes all of the elements that we believe are crucial in understanding ethical decision making. In essence, whenever an ethical dilemma is faced by us and or our colleagues, there are several things, values, obligations, consequences that need to be considered in coming up with an appropriate or an acceptable response to that particular dilemma. And I'm going to go to in more detail on each of these particular elements. Another way of looking at this is the whole notion of determining what really is right, and identifying various kinds of dilemmas to help us understand what we might be facing. So identifying those key values that are at stake or that are involved, identifying the obligations that you have as an individual, let's say as a professional higher education administrator, when you are faced with this particular dilemma, and consider the various kinds of consequences that you or others will be facing based upon decisions that are made. In essence, what are the possible responses of your particular actions by others? And then you take actions based on all of this understanding, and then always, I would recommend, evaluate what has happened so that you can constantly improve your ethical decision-making skills. In essence, it's not a static sort of thing, it's a dynamic thing that will help you enhance your ability to make ethical decisions. So there are some key assumptions for this particular model. Some of them I have mentioned in some respects already, but let me just enumerate them for you. Number one, already mentioned that it is a process that must be used in making ethical decisions rather than operating from some prescriptive, fundamental, or this is the way it has always been done approach. Second, ethics must become a part of your practice as a professional, so that it's not just a moral club or some dictatorial requirement or decree that's used to keep someone in line or in order. And number three, what we're hoping to do with our model is actually to demystify or destigmatize ethics rather than it being something amorphous or difficult to understand. And then finally, we believe that each one of us can promote ethical practice by our own examples, by the consistency of our decision making, and by operating from our own personal code of ethics. I'll talk more about this notion of a personal code of ethics in later slides. That's a part of learning activity number 5B. Thus, this is why Ralph and I came up with the title of our book, Toward Ethical Practice, so that you're always trying to enhance your skills to move toward ethical practice. There are various kinds of ethical dilemmas that you probably have already faced many times and will face in the future, especially as a higher education leader, administrator. And so here are some of the types. There are probably others that you could think of, but the kind of ethical dilemmas, types of dilemmas that you might face in your role as a higher education leader. This first one, justice versus mercy. This most likely is not quite as relevant for a lot of higher education leaders, but think in the case of Jerry Sandusky at Penn State over a year ago, and the boys that he molested. Then such issues can come up in terms of justice versus mercy, and some of this has been talked about in the literature, and of course there's a lot of litigation going on as I make this presentation. Second, there are long-term versus short-term dilemmas. For example, raising tuition costs in higher education, an extra percentage point for the short-term need, But then that, of course, has various kinds of long-term impacts on students not being able to attend college at all, or attend it very slowly, or having to drop out because of the cost. The third one, of truth versus loyalty, this is the whole notion of, just as an example, accepting money from certain donors versus, in higher education, versus living up to what is meant by, here at Lemoyne, the one Lemoyne vision, or our strategic plan. I had a colleague, Dr. Maury Volan, years ago, who was fired from North Carolina State University because he was doing research on, at the time, this is many years ago, on research on tobacco and its potential cause on cancer. And because North Carolina State was receiving a lot of money from funders relating to tobacco, the tobacco industry, he was let go. And that's always stuck in my mind as this notion of telling the truth versus just showing loyalty to an institution. And then this fourth one of self versus organization. This is, for example, like some prestigious faculty promoting themselves as experts for the big bucks and forgetting what they actually owe back to their school in terms of what they do with students and for the institution. There's been news lately that some of the institutions have various professors who are experts on some topics, and they're making very huge dollars, but they're not necessarily spending the time that they need to, as an example, on campus or in the classroom. This, just a bit more on what I had mentioned earlier, this notion of right versus right. Often higher education programs or endeavors are not necessarily providing information that is right or wrong, but offering differing views of what is right. Thus, our goal as leaders needs to be trying to find the right balance between education for individual student development versus education for societal benefits. In essence, what do we include in our college programs and courses versus what do we leave out? Should we stress only liberal arts at Lemoyne, for example, or should we encourage students to participate in internships and other activities that would provide for them lots of practical experience? So as a higher education leader, you may be called upon to make such decisions as these. Okay, now we're going to look at this model a little more specifically. And let's take a closer look at it. I am showing the elements that I'm going to be talking about with a red arrow. So in this first case, we're going to take a closer look at the whole notion of values. Values means what do I believe and how committed am I to what those beliefs are. Not only are beliefs and is it beliefs and commitments, but also how committed am I to those beliefs. In my understanding of human nature, my ethical beliefs about such issues as personal integrity, personal responsibility, promoting personal responsibility in learners, respect for other people. There are a number of questions like that can be raised. So how do or how will those various values drive my practice and my way of working through something like the EDM, the ethical decision-making model that we've come up with? One issue has to do with the respect that we have for others. There are some bulleted points there that you can take a look at, but take, for example, one aspect of this, the respect each of us has for others. What are, for example, your beliefs about others in terms of their deserving respect? You're treating people as you would like to be treated yourself, valuing the opinion and beliefs of others, determining how you deal with your own personal anger, hate, anxiety, ability to forgive, all these kinds of things. These can conjure up sometimes very difficult emotions and ways of relating to people, and almost all personal values can go through a similar thought process like this. Okay, the next component that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on is shown again by this arrow, obligations. In this case, obligations um, revolve around the notion of to whom am I, as a higher education leader, responsible. There are, of course, lots of people or audiences to whom you are responsible besides yourself. Family, friends, neighbors, fellow workers, colleagues, bosses, students, even the larger society. Realistically, there can be conflicts within or among these varied audiences. From an ethical viewpoint, an employer may want or require you to do something that you personally feel is repugnant or wrong. Years ago, I directed a very large, heavily funded from a private organization project at Syracuse University. The Kellogg Foundation provided several $1,000,000, and I was directing this project. And we only had started out with this project just a few weeks, and I started getting all kinds of pressure from central administrators and other faculty not associated with my unit that some of the monies that we had should be spent on what they were doing. And this went against what our objectives were and what I had to accomplish to not only achieve my goals, but to satisfy what the Kellogg Foundation was expecting. So I always had to balance what was right in terms of what I knew and what was expected of me. But it became very difficult having to deal with that pressure all the time and having people constantly be letting me know that I should be spending money on their particular activities. So I had obligations to the foundation and obligations to completing the goals that had to serve as the basis or the foundation for what I was doing. Let's look now at this final component of consequences, and there are consequences, of course, that emanate from our actions or decisions. In essence, there are always choices to be made, and making the right choice or decision can be very, very tricky. So what are some of these consequences? In Chapter 2 of in the book that Ralph Brockett and I edited, that's available for you in Blackboard, in that chapter we describe these 3 questions shown here as a mechanism for working through the thought processes and determining possible consequences. So looking at the options that are available and the possible results from any actions that you require, suggest, or take, and then determining which option will best match up with your personal values in the whole process of this thinking through ethical decisions. So there are some options available for resolving ethical dilemmas that you might face. Look at these 5 options here in terms of accepting, changing your position, working to change a policy, subverting a policy, even leaving the situation. Here's one that happened to me, directly related to this. And this was how Ralph and I really came up with this whole notion of looking at options. Years ago, I taught a summer course in a Canadian university. Upon arrival, the department head told me that he hadn't told me this ahead of time, but when I arrived, told me that I must grade on a curve, and this was a graduate course, and fail a certain % of the students. Well, this is something that I had never dealt with before, and it went against everything that I knew about learning plans, enhancing personal responsibility, working with adults as learners, etc. Well, what were my options? I could comply with the department head's wishes, try to change his mind, do it the way that I knew best, or refuse to teach the course. And there probably could have been other kinds of choices, but I was there on site ready to go, and I really couldn't really do much in terms of those particular options. What I chose to do was subvert the policy, and I used what worked for me as an individual. So what I mean by that, well, fortunately, he never checked up on what I was going to be doing before he went off on his own summer vacation. And everyone, I started teaching the class in much the same way that some of you are experiencing with me. People contracted, everybody in the class contracted for an A or a B, and all of them thrived very well in that class. Many of them remarked to me afterward that it was one of the best courses at that institution they had ever had. They had never experienced anything quite like that. Well, when I got back here to Syracuse, and when the department head got home and found out later that the grades I had posted were either A's or B's and I didn't fail anybody, he was absolutely furious and contacted me by phone and by letter and said he would never hire me again, and he did not. And he was always cold to me at professional conferences. But I accepted the consequences of my action and subverting the policy because it fit within my value structure. So some of the steps now that can be taken in this whole process of becoming better adept at ethical practice. Some of the issues facing anyone involved with higher education leadership is determining those values for themselves and thinking through a personal code of ethics. I recommend, for example, dialoguing with others about this notion of right versus right. Perhaps if you're already employed at the institution with some of your colleagues or with friends and colleagues that you have in other areas, what do they believe is right versus right? And going through the kind of reasoning process that I described earlier. This also means being very aware of the various ethical issues that can surface. And remember the mantra within the EDM model of values, obligations, and consequences. So it's a way of those bulleted areas, topics there, it's a way of thinking them through. There are other steps. This notion about obligations and consequences of potential, the consequences of any potential issue and the various reasons you have for worrying about such issues as a leader. There are at least 3 ways that some ethical issues can surface for you, and I said at least because there are probably many others. There can be the whole notion of sin of omission, or what you put into an educational program or endeavor versus what you leave out. I kind of mentioned that a little bit earlier. Number 2, the meaning distortions that can surface because of organizational or political demands that you will face. And these are very real kinds of things that are going to, a higher education leader are going to have to face almost daily. The various organizational or institutional improprieties that can develop, such as placing people in influential governing boards for a higher education institution or those bodies that make decisions, because of either friendships or big donations that were made to the institution versus the notion of including real talent and experience. So these are the kinds of things that will happen, and you can probably think of other sorts of things that could happen of this nature. Some other issues that need to be taken into account. These can include such things as personal biases that you may have yourself, possible discrimination, intended or subtle, that you may make or encounter, and a lack of sensitivity to issues such as religion, societal beliefs, disabilities, misunderstandings, sexual orientation, a lack of respect, etc. These are very real human emotions, activities, and things that happen to all of us that need to be taken into account. In essence, work real hard to show respect for and sensitivity to the feelings and beliefs of others. I think that's what makes us all human in many respects. So the coup d'etat here, what I'm hoping will happen, especially if you've never done this before, is that you will consider developing and creating a personal code of ethics. Or if you've already done so and want to utilize this class as a way of enhancing it, you could re-examine a code in terms of what you are learning about higher education leadership. This is where you would choose from the workbook, Learning Project number 5B. And in one of the chapters, Chapter 6 from the Brockett and Hiemstra book, there is a lot of information in there about creating personal codes of ethics. Here is a template within these bulleted items that you could utilize as a guide for doing that. In essence, it's a way of getting started about situations and actions and incidents or crises that have truly challenged your ethics and you as a professional. So you might want to just take a look at those bulleted items if you're reviewing this PowerPoint presentation after I'm done with this particular lecture. Within the notion of this template is what I call reflective thinking or consideration. This involves discussing such past situations with colleagues and obtaining their opinion on what was right and wrong, perhaps in some decisions that you've already had to have made in some dilemma that you faced. And as I said earlier, do some dialogue and get some feedback from others. Any procedure that works for you in stimulating your thinking about ethics is what I'm hoping will happen. And as you have the time and inclination, I always recommend that as you're coming up with a code, as you're thinking about your values and your ethical leanings, discuss them with other people. In essence, go through some sort of a critical reflection by yourself and or with others. So in creating a personal code of ethics, you can review these later, but here are some questions to be considered that might give you some guidance in developing the code. And so as I said on one of the other slides, I recommend you go back through the PowerPoint presentation and look at these questions and think about them. So the idea of developing your own personal code, what you will find in reading chapters 1, 2, and 6 from the Roger Hiemstra book, Toward Ethical Practice, I'd like to have you think about developing, as I mentioned, your own personal code of ethics, number 5B. Then once you've done that and submitted it to me and anyone else in the class for some feedback, then I recommend with that personal code that you revisit it periodically for updating as you gain new insights, as you have experiences as a higher education, perhaps every 5 years or so. Thus, a code of ethics becomes a dynamic statement as you develop your skills and knowledge as a leader. And a few of you, I think, who may have already created a code of ethics for me in a prior class, you'll note that one of the things that I often say when I'm providing some feedback of your work is that you consider posting a code of ethics in your place of work so that others can know what you're thinking and what you're operating from in terms of a framework or a code. Here are 4 examples. When you go back through this PowerPoint presentation from downloading it from Blackboard, these are all active links, or you can link to them right from the PowerPoint, from the screen, this particular slide screen, and they'll give you examples of how others, I did one of them, but students before you have created these code of ethics. And so it gives you an idea in terms of, after you've gone through the steps within the EDM itself and examining values and beliefs and writing out some detailed statements that you'd like in your own code of ethics. You draft a statement and seek feedback from others, including me, fellow students, professional colleagues, etc. That's kind of what this whole process is about. This is, as I mentioned, it's a dynamic process. You may not, in this course, complete a code of ethics that is exactly where you want it to be, but that's the whole notion of taking some time to do that. Okay. Here is, if you'd like it, a reference for the book itself, and I love this particular as a closing thought from Ken Blanchard and Norman Vincent Peale. I've had a chance to be in conferences in the past. Both of these individuals are now passed away, but outstanding individuals, and I have been in conferences with both of them, and just powerful people. And they wrote this book together, and within that is this great quote: "There is no right way to do a wrong thing." So it's now your turn. Go to the Blackboard forum that's entitled Ethics and Higher Education, and post your thoughts. And we're back. I think you're now probably seeing me. The PowerPoint presentation has disappeared. And I look forward to your participation in this forum and in your development of a code of ethics, and I'll be more than happy to dialogue with you ahead of time if you decide to do that learning project 5B, and look forward to reading anything that you develop.